In 2009, the world's most powerful nations stood before the cameras at Copenhagen and made a promise: $100 billion every year by 2020, delivered to the developing world to help them survive the climate disruption that the industrialized nations had spent 2 centuries creating. It was called a moral reckoning, a debt being paid. The moment the global north finally acknowledged what its factories, its highways, and its power grids had done to the atmosphere that every human being on Earth shares equally, India's negotiators sat in that room. They listened, they noted the numbers, and then they went home and waited. They are still waiting. What you're about to hear is not a story about broken promises. It is a story about a structural realignment of global power, triggered, accelerated, and in many ways made inevitable by the West's failure to deliver on its most loudly advertised commitment to the developing world. This is the story of how climate finance became the moment India stopped waiting for permission and started setting the terms. Here's the data that changes everything you think you know. As of 2023, OECD tracking reports confirmed that the $100 billion annual target was not met in 2020. It was not met in 2021. The figure eventually reported for 2022 was only achieved by counting loans at face value, including private finance developing nations never asked for, and reclassifying existing aid as new climate money. When Oxfam applied a rigorous, independent methodology and stripped out the inflation and the double counting, the real grant equivalent value reaching vulnerable developing nations was closer to $21 to $24 billion per year, not $100 billion, not even half, roughly one-fifth. India did not just notice this gap. India quantified it, documented it, and built an entirely new global strategy around one brutal conclusion: that the West's climate promises are not a financial architecture. They are a negotiating posture. To understand what's happening right now, you have to go back to what was actually agreed in Copenhagen and what the fine print really said. The Copenhagen Accord of 2009 was not a legally binding treaty. That distinction was not an accident. The wording was deliberately softened at the insistence of the United States and other major emitters who understood that a legally binding financial commitment would face domestic political resistance. The phrase used was that developed countries would mobilize $100 billion annually by 2020. Mobilize, not transfer, not guarantee, not appropriate through legislative budgets. Mobilize, a word chosen precisely because it could mean almost anything. Developing nations, including India, accepted this framing because they had limited leverage and because walking away with nothing seemed worse. But they accepted it with their eyes open. India's climate negotiators, some of the most technically sophisticated in the world, understood that mobilize was not a promise. It was a placeholder. And every subsequent year, as the data came in and the gap widened, that understanding hardened into something far more durable. It hardened into strategic doctrine. Now here's where the numbers tell a story that Western forecasters never modeled. Between 2009 and 2020, while the world waited for the $100 billion flow to materialize, India was doing something extraordinary entirely on its own terms. In 2010, India's total installed solar capacity was approximately 10 megawatts. By 2024, that figure had crossed 90 gigawatts. The International Solar Alliance, launched by Prime Minister Modi at COP21 in Paris in 2015, was not a diplomatic gesture. It was India announcing to 120 nations that it was building an entirely alternative institutional architecture for clean energy, one that did not route through the Green Climate Fund or depend on the disbursement timelines of Western treasuries. Here is the macroeconomic structure of what India figured out, that Western policymakers either missed or chose to ignore. The cost of solar photovoltaic technology fell by approximately 90% between 2010 and 2020. Wind power costs fell by nearly 70% over the same period. These were not gradual declines. They were cliff-edge disruptions in the underlying economics of energy infrastructure. And because India had made early institutional commitments through its National Action Plan on climate change, it was positioned to capture the benefits of those cost collapses in ways that smaller developing nations simply could not replicate. India's energy transition was never primarily funded by Western climate finance. It was funded by India's own capital markets, by competitive tariff auctions that attracted domestic and international private capital, and by the sheer scale of Indian demand that gave manufacturers and developers a reason to localize production and drive costs further down. Here's the comparison that puts everything in perspective. The Green Climate Fund, the primary multilateral vehicle through which the $100 billion commitment was supposed to flow, has disbursed approximately $13.5 billion in total across all its years of operation since 2015. India's solar sector alone attracted over $20 billion in investment in a single recent year. The West's primary climate institution is being outpaced by one country's annual solar investment. This is not meant to dismiss multilateral climate finance as a concept. It is meant to illustrate the scale mismatch that has made Western climate institutions structurally irrelevant to India's actual development trajectory. Now let's move beyond the solar panels, because the deeper consequence of the climate finance gap is not economic. It is political. And it operates at a level of institutional architecture that most commentary completely fails to engage with. There is a principle in climate diplomacy called common but differentiated responsibilities. It was not invented by India. It was agreed to by the United States, the European Union, the United Kingdom, every major developed nation that signed the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in 1992. It was the explicit acknowledgement that it would be structurally unjust to demand that nations which contributed minimally to historical carbon loading take on the same proportional cost of decarbonization as the nations that industrialized first. India's per capita emissions today remain a fraction of those of the United States and most of Western Europe. India's cumulative historical contribution to atmospheric carbon is a fraction of the G7's aggregate. These are not debating points, they are measurements. So when the $100 billion commitment went undelivered, and when the accounting used to eventually claim the target was met was exposed as systematically inflated, it did not land in New Delhi as a budgetary inconvenience. It landed as a geopolitical signal. It signaled that the West was willing to use climate diplomacy as a soft power instrument to extract concessions and commitments from developing nations, while declining to honor the financial reciprocity that made those concessions politically sustainable in the first place. India's response has been one of the most sophisticated exercises in strategic autonomy that any emerging power has executed in the post-Cold War era. At COP26 in Glasgow in 2021, it was India's team that inserted phase down rather than phase out for coal into the final agreement text. Western media framed this as obstruction. What it actually was principled conditionality. India's position was not that it wanted to burn coal forever. India's position was that it would not accept a timeline it could not finance without the concessional capital the West had promised and not delivered. The coal language was not a climate position. It was a leverage position, and it worked exactly as intended. India did not just use the leverage defensively, it deployed it to structurally reshape the global order. The Indian presidency of the G20 in 2023 was not managed as a diplomatic formality. It was deployed as a strategic platform. India used its G20 year to advance the inclusion of the African Union as a permanent member, a move that significantly shifted the political center of gravity of the world's primary economic coordination body toward the global south. The G20 represents approximately 85% of global GDP. When India used its chair year to systematically expand the voice of the global south within that architecture, it was not hosting a summit, it was restructuring the room. And it did so with the precision of a nation that has spent a decade building the institutional credibility and bilateral relationships necessary to lead a coalition representing most of the world's population, most of the world's future growth, and a rapidly expanding share of global financial and technological capacity. Consider India's vertical integration of clean energy strategy, domestic manufacturing scaled by production-linked incentive schemes, installation at gigawatt pace, multilateral institutional leadership through the International Solar Alliance, and development finance relationships across Africa and Southeast Asia designed to compete directly with both Western development banks and China's Belt and Road instruments. No Western government imagined this architecture when it made the Copenhagen Commitment in 2009. The assumption was that developing nations would be recipients of technology and finance from the industrialized world. India systematically dismantled that assumption and replaced it with a model in which it is simultaneously a transitioning economy, a technology manufacturer, a development financier, and a diplomatic leader. The first-order story, India builds renewables, West underfunds developing nations, is reasonably well documented, but the second-order effects are where the strategic intelligence becomes genuinely consequential. First, the accelerating erosion of Western institutional credibility across the global South. The climate finance failure has given every developing nation a specific, quantifiable, and repeatable data point. When a Western official speaks about the rules-based international order, the institutional memory of the $100 billion accounting manipulation is present in every room. Second, India's transformation from a consumer of clean energy technology to a producer and standard setter. India's ambition is not simply to install capacity, it is to manufacture the components, reduce import dependence, and become a significant exporter of clean energy technology to the very global South markets it is cultivating through diplomatic and development finance channels. Third, the complete inversion of the dominant climate narrative. For decades, developing nations, India in particular, were cast as the obstacle at climate negotiations. The country that slowed deals, refused firm timelines, pushed back on language. What the data has done over the past decade is systematically reverse that narrative. India's renewable deployment velocity is among the highest in the world. Its per capita emissions remain vastly below developed nations at comparable stages of development. And its diplomatic leadership has constructed a clear alternative account of where primary accountability for the climate transition actually lies. The new climate finance goal being negotiated to replace the expired $100 billion target reflects how dramatically the terms of this debate have shifted. Developing nations, in coalitions where India plays a central role, are pushing for a new target in the range of $1 trillion annually, grounded in scientific assessments of actual transition costs. India's posture going into that negotiation is informed skepticism combined with active construction of alternative architecture. It is not waiting for the new target to be agreed before advancing its clean energy agenda. It is deploying domestically, building multilateral institutions, expanding development finance relationships, and accumulating the leverage that comes from demonstrated capability. Here's the structural irony that defines this entire story. By proving that its promises were unreliable, the West inadvertently liberated India from the strategic constraint of dependency. And India has used that liberation with extraordinary discipline. This is the question that should be keeping every strategic investor, every policy analyst, and every serious observer of the global economy awake right now. If the West's most loudly advertised commitment to the developing world, made under the brightest possible moral spotlight with the highest possible rhetorical stakes, turned out to be a fraction of what was promised, enforced by no mechanism and verified by no independent body, what does that tell you about the durability of every other institutional arrangement the Western-led order depends on? India has answered that question with policy, with investment, and with architecture. The rest of the world is watching and drawing its own conclusions.